Grandpa, come on. You, in the army? You worked at a hardware store your whole life. That was the sentence that changed everything. Not said with cruelty, said with a laugh. An easy, dismissive laugh from my own grandson, at my own dinner table, 3 months before 300 United States Marines stood in formation at a funeral home parking lot to honor a man his family had spent years quietly deciding was exaggerating his own life story. But we'll get there. 2 months after that dinner, I was sitting in a small conference room at Harmon Family Funeral Home, going through what they call a pre-need consultation, the polite industry term for planning your own funeral while you're still alive to plan it. When the director looked up from his paperwork, glanced out the window at the parking lot, and said very quietly, "Mr. Holt, I think you'd better come see this." And I remember standing at that window, looking out at a sight I never once expected to see, arranged in my honor, while I still had breath left to witness it myself. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Raymond Holt. I'm 79 years old. I live alone now in a small house at the edge of a quiet town in Ohio, the same house my wife Doris and I raised our daughter Susan in, the same house I've lived in since I came home from the service in 1967 and took a job at the hardware store on Main Street, a job I held, one way or another, for the next 36 years, working my way up from stock clerk to store manager to, eventually, the fellow who trained 3 generations of Main Street kids on how to properly cut a key or mix a gallon of paint. Doris passed 9 years ago. Susan lives 2 towns over with her husband Mark and their 2 boys, Tyler and Cody, who are 17 and 14 now, old enough to have opinions about their grandfather that I've slowly come to understand were formed more by what they assumed about me than by anything I'd actually told them. Here's the thing about me that my family over the years mostly stopped believing, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a shoebox on the top shelf of my bedroom closet the entire time. Before the hardware store, before Doris, before I was simply Grandpa Ray, the guy from the store, I served 4 years in the United States Army, including 13 months in Vietnam, attached for a significant stretch of that deployment to a joint operations unit working alongside a Marine reconnaissance company in circumstances that don't come up easily in casual conversation, even 50 years later. I earned a Silver Star during that deployment for an action on a hillside outside a village whose name I still don't say out loud easily, an action that saved the lives of 11 Marines from that reconnaissance company, men who weren't even my own unit, men I'd known for barely 6 weeks before that hillside, men some of whom I'm still in contact with, quietly, decades later, through letters and the occasional phone call that Susan and the boys never knew anything about. The specifics of that afternoon are not something I've ever found easy to compress into a dinner table story, which is part of why, I think, the silence around it grew so comfortable over the decades. We'd been providing security for a Marine reconnaissance patrol that walked directly into an ambush on a hillside overlooking a river valley, and in the confusion that followed, with 2 Marines already down and the rest of the patrol pinned by fire from a tree line we hadn't spotted in time, I made a series of decisions in the space of about 11 minutes that I've spent the rest of my life trying not to relive in too much detail. Decisions that resulted in 11 men making it off that hillside who otherwise, by every account given afterward, would not have. I was wounded twice that afternoon, once in the shoulder and once, more seriously, along my left side, injuries that kept me in a field hospital for the better part of 6 weeks, and that still, on cold mornings, remind me of that hillside in ways I've never fully explained to anyone in my own family. When I came home in 1967, I made a decision, one that felt right at the time, and that I've never fully regretted, even now. The country wasn't kind to Vietnam veterans in those years, and I didn't want to spend my life explaining a war most people wanted to forget, defending a service record to people who'd already decided what they thought about it before I opened my mouth. So I put the medal in a shoebox, took the job at the hardware store, married Doris, raised Susan, and simply didn't discuss those 13 months very often. Not because I was ashamed of them, but because the silence felt, for decades, like the easier and safer choice. Susan grew up knowing, vaguely, that her father had been in the Army, the way you know a fact without ever bothering to understand its actual weight. She never asked many questions, and I never volunteered many answers, and somewhere in that mutual silence, the truth of those 13 months slowly calcified, in her mind and eventually in her son's minds, into something closer to family legend than family fact. The kind of thing an old man says that nobody quite believes anymore, the way an old man might claim he once shook hands with a president or caught a fish the size of a canoe. I want to be clear about something. I don't think Susan or the boys were ever cruel on purpose. I think, over the years, my own reluctance to discuss those 13 months, combined with the ordinary skepticism kids develop toward their grandparents' old stories, calcified into an assumption that felt, to them, more like affectionate teasing than actual disbelief. There was a Veterans Day a few years back when I wore a small pin on my jacket to a school event for Tyler, and one of his classmates asked what branch I'd served in, and Tyler, standing right beside me, said, laughing, "Grandpa likes to say he was in the Army, but honestly, I think he just likes the pin," a comment that got a laugh from the other kids, and that Tyler clearly meant as harmless, affectionate ribbing, rather than genuine dismissal. There was a career day at Cody's middle school, the year after that, when I volunteered, as several grandparents did, to speak briefly to a classroom about my working life, and a teacher, reviewing the brief biography Cody had submitted on my behalf, gently corrected the line about military service, telling Cody, within my hearing, "Let's just focus on the hardware store part, sweetie. Keep it simple," clearly assuming the Army detail was some embellishment a 12-year-old had added for flavor, rather than an actual fact about his grandfather's life. There was a 4th of July barbecue, the year after that, when Mark, my son-in-law, joked to a group of neighbors that Ray's got some great old war stories, half of them probably true, a comment delivered with a friendly grin that landed, for me, with considerably more weight than Mark likely intended. There was a hospital waiting room, during a minor procedure I'd had the previous year, when a nurse, filling out intake paperwork, asked routinely about military service, and Susan, sitting beside me, answered for me before I could, saying, "He likes to say he was in Vietnam." I think it might be more of a family story than anything documented, a comment that made the nurse smile politely and move on to the next question without further investigation, and that I let stand, uncorrected, the way I'd let so many similar comments stand over the years. There was an afternoon, about a year ago, when I overheard Susan on the phone with a friend through the kitchen doorway, discussing an upcoming family gathering, saying, "Dad might tell one of his Army stories. Just smile and nod. He gets a kick out of it, and it doesn't hurt anybody." I stood in that hallway for a good 10 seconds, listening to my own daughter describe 13 months of my life, a silver star, and 11 men I'd carried off a hillside as harmless entertainment to be humored. And then I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee, and said nothing about what I'd heard. She never knew I'd heard a word. And then there was the dinner. 3 months before the funeral home parking lot, when Tyler, now 17, and increasingly confident in his own opinions, laughed outright when I mentioned, almost offhandedly, something about my time in the service. "Grandpa, come on, you? In the Army? You worked at a hardware store your whole life." The whole table laughed, gently, affectionately, the way families laugh at a joke they've all silently agreed to find charming rather than examine closely. I laughed too, because by then I'd had decades of practice laughing along with a version of my own history that had quietly been reduced to a running joke. I want to be honest about what that particular moment cost me, because I think it matters more than any of the moments before it. I'd carried 11 Marines off that hillside, one at a time, under fire, at 22 years old, and buried 2 friends in the weeks that followed who hadn't made it off other hillsides. And at 79, at my own family's dinner table, that entire chapter of my life had become a joke my own grandson made to get an easy laugh from the room. I didn't say anything that night, but something in me, quietly, made a decision. I'd been diagnosed, about 6 months earlier, with a heart condition my doctor described carefully as serious, manageable for now, but worth planning around. I hadn't told Susan or the boys the full extent of it. Some habits of quiet self-sufficiency, I've learned, don't fully break even after 79 years. But I'd started, privately, working through the practical matters a man in my position needs to work through, including, about 2 months after that dinner, a pre-need consultation at Harmon Family Funeral Home, planning the actual details of my own service, the way careful men of my generation often do, so their families won't have to make difficult decisions during an already difficult time. I want to describe what happened during that consultation exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, though it began, quietly, with a decision I made almost as an afterthought. Sitting across from the funeral director, a kind, unhurried man named Gerald Pruitt, working through the details of the service, the readings, the music, the modest reception afterward, I mentioned, almost in passing, that I'd like military honors included, if that was something they could arrange. Gerald asked, professionally, for my service details, and I gave them to him. The full record this time, not the shorthand version I'd given my own family for decades. The Army service, the 13 months in Vietnam, the joint operation with the Marine Reconnaissance Company, the Silver Star, the names of the men I'd carried off that hillside, several of whom I was still, quietly, in contact with. Gerald, it turned out, had a nephew who was active duty Marine Corps, stationed not far from a Marine Corps League chapter that, as I would soon learn, took the honoring of decorated veterans considerably more seriously than most people realize. Without my full knowledge, I'd mentioned the names of a few of the men from that hillside, including one, a retired gunnery sergeant named Cal Whitfield, who I'd stayed close with over the decades. Gerald made a phone call after our consultation ended, mostly out of professional curiosity, to verify the service record I'd given him. That phone call reached Cal Whitfield within 48 hours. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew, 3 weeks later, arriving for a follow-up consultation to finalize the details, was that Gerald met me at the door with an expression I couldn't quite read and asked if I'd mind stepping into the conference room for a few minutes before we got started. We'd been talking for perhaps 20 minutes, going over the final arrangements, when Gerald glanced out the window, went very still, and said, "Mr. Holt, I think you'd better come see this." I want to describe this moment exactly as it happened, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened without a single word of warning. I stood at that window and looked out at the funeral home parking lot, and what I saw stopped my breath more completely than my own heart condition had managed to in 6 months of careful monitoring. 300 Marines, in dress uniform, standing in formation across that parking lot, stretching back toward the road in neat, silent rows. More men than I could properly count from that window. More men than I'd seen assembled in one place since the day I came home from Vietnam 50-some years earlier. At the front of that formation stood Cal Whitfield, 81 years old now, in his own dress uniform, standing at attention beside a man I didn't recognize, a younger Marine Corps officer who I would later learn was the current commanding officer of the very reconnaissance company I'd served alongside on that hillside. A unit that, remarkably, still existed, still trained, still carried forward, in its institutional memory, the story of the Army sergeant who'd pulled 11 of their predecessors off a burning hillside decades before most of these young men were even born. Cal called every chapter of the Marine Corps League within driving distance, Gerald told me quietly, standing beside me at that window, and apparently the current unit heard about it too, and asked to send a delegation. I didn't know it was going to be this many, Mr. Holt. I truly didn't. I walked out to that parking lot on legs that didn't feel entirely steady, and Cal Whitfield met me halfway across it, pulling me into an embrace that neither of us tried very hard to make brief. "You didn't think we'd let you plan your own send-off without us knowing about it, did you, Ray?" Cal said, his voice thick. 11 men are alive today, and their children and their grandchildren, because of what you did on that hillside. When Gerald called asking questions about your record, I made some calls of my own. "Cal, this is..." I couldn't finish the sentence. I stood there looking at 300 faces, most of them younger than my own grandchildren, none of whom had been alive when that hillside happened. All of them standing at attention in a funeral home parking lot because a story had traveled through an institution's memory long enough, and clearly enough, to matter to men who'd never met me. The young commanding officer stepped forward next, extending his hand. "Sergeant Holt," he said, "on behalf of the entire company, past and present, we wanted you to know, while you're still here to know it, exactly what your actions on that hillside meant, and continue to mean, to every Marine who's ever served in this unit since. We teach your action in our unit history briefings, sir. Every Marine who joins this company learns the name Raymond Holt within their first month." "I had no idea," I said, and it was the truest thing I could manage to say in that moment. "Most men who do what you did never do know," Cal said quietly. "That's usually how it works." I stood in that parking lot, in front of 300 Marines, standing in formation for a funeral rehearsal that had somehow become something else entirely. And I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. 50 years of quiet, carefully managed silence, decades of letting my own family gently laugh off a chapter of my life I'd never found the right way to make them understand, all of it seemed to lift, at once, standing in a funeral home parking lot surrounded by men who understood exactly what that hillside had cost, and exactly what it had meant. I hadn't told Susan about any of this. I hadn't told her about the pre-need consultation, about the heart condition, about any of it, in the careful, self-sufficient way I'd managed most difficult things throughout my life. But someone, I later learned it was Gerald, using the emergency contact information from my file, genuinely uncertain whether I might need family support given the scale of what was unfolding, had called Susan that morning, simply saying there was something at the funeral home involving your father that you should probably see in person. Susan arrived partway through the ceremony that followed, because it became, unofficially, a ceremony, right there in that parking lot, the young commanding officer reading a formal citation summary of the hillside action, while 300 Marines stood in respectful silence, Cal Whitfield standing beside me the entire time with a hand on my shoulder. I watched Susan get out of her car, take in the scene, 300 Marines in formation, her father standing at the center of it, visibly overcome, and I watched her face go through a transformation I'll remember for whatever years I have left. She found me after the formal portion ended, tears on her face, Tyler and Cody trailing behind her, both boys uncharacteristically silent, taking in a scene that dwarfed anything either of them had previously imagined about their grandfather's life. "Dad," Susan said, "what is all of this? Why didn't you ever tell me?" I want to answer that question honestly, the way I answered it that afternoon, because I think it matters more than the ceremony itself. Because for 50 years, telling people meant explaining a war nobody wanted to hear about, and eventually it just became easier to let it stay quiet, I said. And somewhere along the way, Susan, quiet became a habit I didn't know how to break, even with my own family. Tyler stepped forward, his face pale, clearly working through the same math I'd watched Bradley and countless others work through in stories like this one. The sudden, jarring recalibration of a family member you'd quietly decided you understood completely. "Grandpa," he said, his voice small in a way I hadn't heard from him in years, at dinner, when I laughed about the Army thing. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's not really your fault, Tyler. I let that joke exist for years before you ever made it." You just said out loud what I'd let the whole family quietly believe. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the parking lot is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Susan sitting with me over the following weeks, asking careful, genuine questions about those 13 months. Questions that required sitting with answers that didn't resolve neatly into simple, impressive stories. It's Tyler and Cody both, in their own ways, working through what it meant to have spent years gently mocking a chapter of their grandfather's life that had, it turned out, saved 11 lives on a hillside neither of them had ever heard the name of until that afternoon. There was an evening, about 2 weeks later, when Tyler asked if he could see the silver star itself, the actual medal, still sitting in its shoebox on the top shelf of my closet. I brought it down and set it on the kitchen table, and he sat looking at it for a long time before he spoke. "Why'd you keep it in a shoebox?" he asked. "Something like this. I feel like most people would have it framed, hanging up somewhere. Because for most of my life, I wasn't sure I wanted to look at it every day," I said. "Some medals come with a weight that doesn't get lighter just because time passes. I earned that star on the worst day of my life, Tyler. It's not something I ever wanted displayed like a trophy." "Cal said 11 men are alive because of you," he said. "Their whole families exist because of what you did." "That's the part I've made peace with," I said. "The part I never quite made peace with is that 2 other men, from my own unit, didn't come home from other hillsides that same deployment. I think that's part of why I went quiet about all of it for so long. It never felt like a clean enough story to tell at a dinner table." Cody, who'd been quieter than his older brother through most of this, spoke up for the first time that evening. "Grandpa, at career day, my teacher told me to leave out the Army part of your bio because she thought I'd made it up." "I never told you that. I'm sorry I let her think that." "You were 12, Cody," I said. "That's not a thing you needed to apologize for. If anyone owes an apology in that story, it's an old man who never gave you enough to work with to defend the truth properly." Cal Whitfield came to visit a few weeks after that, the 2 of us sitting on my porch the way we used to sit on porches decades earlier, before life and distance and the ordinary business of raising families had put states between us. "You should have called me sooner, Ray," he said. "Not for the ceremony, just to talk. I've missed you these past years." "I've missed you too," I said. I think I let myself believe staying quiet about the past meant staying at peace with it. Turns out those aren't quite the same thing. "You know," Cal said, looking out at the yard, "half the men in that formation drove 3-4 hours to be there. Some of them are grandsons of Marines who served with you, not even veterans themselves, just family who grew up hearing your name at reunions. That story didn't stay in a shoebox the way you thought it did, Ray. It just wasn't sitting in your shoebox anymore. It moved into 100 other families' shoeboxes instead, and grew roots you never got to see." I sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the same yard, feeling something shift quietly into place that 50 years of silence had never quite managed to settle on its own. I watched my family, in the weeks that followed, do something I hadn't fully seen them do before. I watched Susan begin introducing me, at church, at the grocery store, to people who'd known our family for years, as my father, Sergeant Raymond Holt, Silver Star recipient, a description she'd never once used in decades of casual introductions, delivered now with a pride that had clearly needed an entire parking lot full of Marines to fully surface. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled, in whatever way a heart condition and an approaching end allow a situation to settle. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for over 50 years. I thought about Doris a great deal in those weeks, what she would have said, watching our daughter finally understand the full shape of the man she'd married, watching our grandsons learn to sit with a version of their grandfather more complicated than the one they'd grown comfortable joking about. I think Doris would have been proudest not of the parking lot ceremony itself, but of the porch conversations and kitchen table questions that followed it. It's been several months now since that afternoon at Harmon Family Funeral Home. My heart condition remains what my doctor carefully calls serious, manageable for now, and I've made my peace, as much as any man can, with not knowing exactly how much time that phrase actually allows me. But I no longer spend that time in quiet, careful silence about who I actually was on that hillside 50 years ago. Susan visits every week now, often with the boys, and we sit on the porch and talk, sometimes about those 13 months, sometimes about nothing important at all, which is its own kind of gift after decades of a silence neither of us fully understood we'd been keeping. Tyler asked me, a few weeks ago, if I'd be willing to speak to his history class about Vietnam, an invitation that would have seemed impossible to imagine at that dinner table 3 months earlier. I agreed, on my own terms, sharing only as much as felt right to share with a room full of 17-year-olds who'd never fully understand the weight of a hillside they'd only ever hear about secondhand. Last week, Susan helped me finally take that silver star out of its shoebox and have it properly framed, mounted alongside a photograph Cal had given me from that reconnaissance company, an image of 11 young Marines, most of them gone now, standing together on a base somewhere in 1967, alive because of an afternoon none of us have ever fully stopped carrying. "Why'd you keep all of this hidden for so long?" Susan asked me, sitting with me while we hung the frame. "Not just from strangers, from me, from the boys." "Because I didn't want you to know your father as a soldier first," I said. "I wanted you to know him as your father. The man who ran the hardware store, who taught you to ride a bike in the driveway, who was simply present for an ordinary, steady life. The soldier survived something terrible. The father was for making sure you never had to carry the weight of that hillside alongside me." She looked at the framed photograph a long moment, then up at me. "You could have been both the whole time," she said. "I just never asked the right questions, and I let it become easier to gently laugh along than to actually understand what I was laughing at. I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take, or because a joke repeated enough times starts to feel truer than the person it's actually about. Tyler laughed at my Army stories for years, because I let the stories become a joke long before he ever made one out loud. He wasn't entirely wrong that I'd made those 13 months easy to dismiss. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now I sit on the porch and think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent over 50 years being a man very few people fully understood, not because I hid it out of shame, but because silence, once it becomes habit, has a way of outliving the reasons you first chose it. Doris used to say I carried that hillside the way some men carry grief, quietly, respectfully, without needing anyone else's validation of its weight. I think she understood the shape of that quiet better than I ever articulated it myself, even to her. I think, too, about how a family's understanding of someone can drift, gradually, from uncertainty into gentle disbelief, simply because nobody along the way stopped to ask a harder question than the story seemed to invite. Tyler's joke at that dinner table wasn't cruelty. It was the natural endpoint of years of a story nobody had ever taken seriously enough to actually investigate, myself included. I let Grandpa's Army stories become a punchline long before my own grandson ever delivered one, and I understand now that the responsibility for that drift sits mostly with me, not with a 17-year-old repeating an assumption his whole family had quietly modeled for him. I don't regret the years of keeping that shoebox closed. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let my own family joke about a chapter of my life this significant for so long. I'd do it again, in most respects. Every dinner where I let the laughter pass without correction, every year Susan and the boys grew up thinking of Grandpa's Army stories as harmless family legend rather than fact, I would trade some of that discomfort again for the ordinary, steady decades I got to spend, simply being their father and grandfather, rather than a story people felt obligated to take seriously. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not finding a gentler way to correct the record myself, well before a pre-need funeral consultation and 300 Marines had to do it for me. I thought quiet humility was a form of protection, and in many ways it was. But I've learned, watching my daughter finally ask the real questions, and watching my grandson sit with real shame over an offhand joke, that some truths deserve a quieter, more deliberate unveiling than the one circumstance handed us that afternoon in a funeral home parking lot. My family mistook my silence for the absence of a story worth taking seriously, because I let them. I don't blame them for it. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad, in whatever time I have left, that the truth finally had its say. however unusual the setting turned out to be. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a porch in the evening, once the light has gone soft, and the only sound left is whatever the crickets have decided to contribute to the conversation. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for the parking lot full of Marines, or the framed metal on my wall, or the newfound pride in Susan's voice when she introduces me to strangers. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in decades, not because 300 strangers finally validated a story I already knew was true, but because my own family finally understands the shape of the man they've been quietly laughing along with all these years. And that understanding didn't require a single medal to matter, only the willingness, finally, to ask. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person at your table, the one whose stories you've learned to gently smile and nod through, may be carrying something far heavier and far more real than you've ever allowed yourself to imagine. Don't mistake a story you've stopped taking seriously for a story that was never true. And don't wait for 300 strangers in uniform to show up in a parking lot before you finally ask the people you love the real questions about what they actually lived through. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.